Okay, very good. Thank you. Um, Thank you all participants for joining us from all over the world. My slide flip pages.
Yes,
Yes,
Kumar.
yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll talk to you about the road ahead for telecommunications. So today, telecommunications was fairly simple about 5 years ago. But I think after the advent of LTE and smartphones and tablets and other devices, our communications has gotten quite complex. So here are 12 devices that I think most of us routinely communicate with. At 12 o'clock, you have the smartwatch, then Alexa, and probably you cast your Alexa screen onto your TV, to see the YouTube, and then some health monitoring devices. Autonomous cars are coming up. There are some vehicles that already will drive you around some campuses. You can do virtual reality, and I think cameras are become proliferated. They're all interconnected through communications. They send the pictures back. You have tablets, drones, robots, and of course you have the good old-fashioned laptop and mobile phone. But as you can see, we are communicating a lot more with things than we are with people. And that actually is the trend today. So about 20 years ago, when we started Tejas, of course, most of you in the audience may be too young, but we used to say that it's no longer about voice or it is about data, right? And now it's passe. I don't even have to tell you that, but it took a long time before that happened. So now I want to tell you that communication, in particular telecommunication, is no longer between human beings, but mostly between things. And that is what will take over. So human beings, we are more or less at the limit of what we were biologically intended to do. Your screens are already at retinal resolution. So even if you had a much better screen, there's nothing you could do about it. You cannot consume anything more than video. And so even high resolution video, everyone can consume it all the time. There's enough bandwidth to go around. So humans have sort of reached the limit with enhanced mobile broadband. And the next evolution of telecom in 5G, the 5G that we have today or that we'll have in 22 or 23 is essentially a better 4G. It's an enhanced mobile broadband. There are two more aspects of 5G that will start to come up, and they both have to do with things. One is what we loosely used to call IoT, Internet of Things and Internet of Everything. It's really more properly called massive machine type communications. So there will be a lot more of these. We are 6 billion. These will probably be like 60 billion, 10 for each of us. And they all need to communicate with each other. Mostly it's with each other. I'll emphasize that in a moment. It's not so much with us. And some of that is very latency sensitive. So we cannot react at better than like 100 to 200 milliseconds, but machines can react much faster. So a lot of what used to be called the ultra reliable low latency communications, URLLC, is now called critical machine type communications, because most of the low latency applications we can think of are for machines. So drones, autonomous cars, industrial robots, these are the things that will need to communicate over the future telecom networks, starting with 5G. What we need from these is mostly some information, some knowledge, maybe what's going on. But most of the time, a self-driving car is communicating with the network on the road, which is guiding it. The robots are doing their own job, assembling machines. And drones are flying around. May I request the Tejas other panelists to take care of attendees who are raising their hands. I can see Nagendra has raised his hand, so maybe you can chat with him. Thank you.
Yes, Kumar will take.
So what we have to do with things is, of course, we need to get knowledge or information transfer, but we also need to set some rules, some policies, how fast the car can drive, how fast the drone can go, how close the drones can be to each other, things like that for safety mostly, for security, and that's my next slide. But barring after setting these rules and policies, we are content to let the things communicate and do their task. But communications is becoming more and more critical. You can't self-drive a car or fly a drone without communications. So the point I raised is about security. Now, I think today everyone is aware of security because of the J&K issue with the drone attack. There are two intertwined issues, security and privacy. They're different. And I think until 4G, we didn't care so much. There was a little bit of concern about security, mostly for banking transactions, monetary transactions, and so on. But privacy has now become a big concern. I would say, especially for our generation. The next generation doesn't seem to care. They'd rather share everything that they're doing, including what they're eating for every meal, what they're doing at this minute, and so on. But our generation is still caught up with this notion of privacy. So we'd like to keep things private. And it's also important from the financial transactions. Today, everything that we do, including all our money, is somewhere on the internet. So we need to have privacy and security, right? So we don't want people to know what we're doing. It's privacy, and we don't want people to steal anything or know anything, and so on. So that's the security part. Of course, for things, security is paramount. We can't have drones attacking us. I used to say this even last month. I said it in a talk before this drone attack happened in J&K. But you can imagine that preventing accidents, preventing attacks by drones, all that is a major aspect that communication service providers and networks will be expected to take care of in the next evolution. And again, humans will enforce rules to ensure there is security. This will be dictated by geopolitics, which countries are friends, which countries are enemies, who's going to attack whom, and so on. And for security, there will be encryption of various kinds. But this is getting more and more important as we today. Another thing that's happening is, of course, as I said, humans and things are communicating, and a lot more things. We used to have a distinction between enterprise networks and telecom networks. There was always this enterprise class of switches, enterprise equipment, and then there was telco grade. But a lot of it is coming together. So we had, that's also partly because, homes have become offices thanks to COVID, and all of us, probably most of you, are listening to me from your homes, which have now become your offices. So partly as a consequence, but some similar trend. A lot of the equipment technology which started life in the enterprise is moving now to telecom service providers, the TSPs. So, for example, low cost optics, in terms of QSFPs, really started in Ethernet switches in the enterprise. Now they are pretty much prevalent in the telcos. The data center interconnection switches, again, are souped up versions of the enterprise switches. If you bought your laptop in your office, your IT department would load a preloaded version of Windows and Office and every other application, and so that all the software was similar, right? It didn't matter which hardware you had. The telcos like this, making all their hardware look the same and load the software themselves and not let the vendor do it. So this is somewhat the genesis of virtual RAN, virtual OLTs, and so on. So they have borrowed this technology. We used to have, a telecom grade of redundancy. But now we borrowed from the enterprise and we stack switches. We do the leaf spine architecture, which again came from data centers, which is like a large enterprise. It's also true that technology and ideas are moving the other way around. We all like the fact how convenient it is to use the LTE phone. Probably most of us, to avoid Wi-Fi switching or some other reason, maybe security in the office, we tend to use our phones connected to the LTE network rather than switch to the Wi-Fi. And so there are many advantages, because you can connect directly to the WAN. Mobility is easy. You can move around. You don't have to worry about handovers, which are harder to do with Wi-Fi and not perfected. So it's not impossible. So this technology is moving back to the enterprise as private LTE, and the same thing will happen with 5G as private 5G. I think PON started life in the the telcos to provide connectivity to homes, but I won't be surprised if sometime from now the connectivity in your office is based on PON rather than an Ethernet cable or Ethernet port which you connect, because you have to connect many devices. It's probably easier to wire PON fiber even in the offices. So technology is moving back and forth between enterprises and telcos, and so both those networks are looking increasingly similar. So what's the roadmap? Where are we headed in terms of communication or broadband communication? I started life with copper lines. I used to dial up to my office from my home in the 1990s, did AT, DT, some commands. Then in the early 2000s, I always had a DSL connection back to my office, a server in the office, a PC at home. Laptops were there, but not so widely prevalent. So I used to sync up and work from home on a DSL connection. Around 2010, fiberization was slow. I still had DSL, but I think all of us up until a year ago, the 4 or 5 years preceding that, we were very happy with the 4G LTE connection as our broadband. We had these MiFi devices. We used to convert them to hotspots. We even used our mobile as a hotspot for others. So that was the broadband we knew. For most of us, that served as the broadband at home as well, an LTE connection with MiFi. You connect your laptop to that, and that sort of worked. But come COVID, we saw that that is not enough at all. In fact, I used to have 250 GB a month at home, used by my family. And when COVID first struck in 2020, on April 25th, I ran out of 250 GB. I didn't realize we were using so much. And then I had to buy some extra bandwidth. The next month, I upgraded to 2 terabytes. So a family of 4 today needs about a terabyte to go through working from home and learning from home and doing constant video conferencing. So fiber to the home is an absolute necessity. And you shouldn't be surprised. This is running on a fiber connection to my home. Only thing I lack is redundancy. I have to worry about the fiber cut, which, by the way, has happened about 3 times in the last 15 months. So everyone's now scrambling to get a high-speed fiber connection at home. This will only get better because at home now we were used to watching things on the phone, high resolution. But now I think we will go back to, we want better technology. And COVID has also shown us that video conferencing needs to move from talking heads to nearly lifelike things. And some technology is being developed. So we will have holographic type communications, I think, in a few years. So where we can sit and talk to others in 3D. And like most things, these predictions look absurd, but within 5 years, it sort of becomes a reality. So that's what we expect to happen. And there'll be a lot more things at home. And we will also need to communicate in very, very fast vehicles. Cars will get driven faster. We'll be in high-speed trains. Maybe it'll be in some of these hyperloop things, tunnels in cities. So whatever it is, we'll be moving very fast when we are moving. There'll be a lot more things to communicate. And we need holographic communications to do this, so you can see not just my talking head in 2D, but in 3D. So this is where we are headed in terms of broadband communication. If we just sort of step back and look at all the forms of communication that we have optical access to our homes. We have high-speed optical access, usually a different kind, which is redundant rings and so on, to our offices, which are enterprises, but some of this technology is merging, so redundancy is coming into optical access as well. Then we have wireless access where you can't reach the fiber. So clearly for cars, for drones, and for industrial robots and so on, which are things, anything which is moving, you can't reach with fiber, so you reach with wireless access. By the way, I think self-driving cars and self-driving cones are not so far away. I think self-driving vehicles in campuses are already a reality. A drone, we have to just get past the security regulations and so on. After that, we will start seeing food delivered by drones routinely. And we all need to get stuff delivered by drones. Today in Bangalore, we get everything delivered by Dunzo. And so I think drones will do a better job of that. And then with these three forms of access, by access, I mean the network that reaches the consumer. Then we have to do aggregation, which is based on either packet technology or WDM and OTN technologies, depending on your preference as well as the bandwidth involved. So this is how the communication network looks end to end. I'm happy to tell you in Tejas, we have one box which does all three forms of access and packet aggregation. We call that universal converged broadband. So I'll talk about the roadmap in all of these areas, all four really, which is the three forms of access: optical access, enterprise access, wireless access, as well as optical aggregation, which is like the backhaul for all these access technologies. So let's start with optical access. So today we are at GPON. I think most of you who have a fiber connection at home have a GPON connection, which gives you 2.5 gig downlink speed shared across your neighbors, and about 1.25 gig uplink. Soon you will have 10 gig PON, and the symmetric version is what is popular because we can have symmetric. Why do you want asymmetry? And as you can see, we all need symmetry. I'm doing this from my home, so my uplink bandwidth today is actually far more I'm using at this moment than my downlink bandwidth. So symmetric PON gives you 10 gig uplink and downlink. Next year, we will have NG-PON 2, which is a WDM version of 10 gig PON. So you will have 4 different wavelengths at 10 gig each. So that quadruples the capacity to 40 gig. This is almost on the corner. I think Verizon in the US has already deployed it, so others won't be far behind. But that isn't enough, because it looks like if you really want to do things like holographic communications at home, do 3D video conferencing, you need 50 gig PON, and the 50 gig on a single wavelength. And that is what will come up about 2 years from now. It's in the process of being standardized at ITU. And beyond that, you have even higher speed WDM PON, TDM and WDM PON with 50 gig wavelengths, with 50 gig speeds. You have point-to-point WDM if you want even more capacity than 50 gig between 2 points in the network. So PON is not to be left behind. It's getting to very high speed versions. So this technology, which is giving you broadband at the home, can actually become the centerpiece of the telecom network for a lot of things, which I'll show you. So, and also it's being done in a way which is easily retrofitted. So let's say next year you have GPON and XGS PON. So you have 2 transmitters. It sort of get combined into one module and a common receiver, and the outdoor network is the same. So some homes can have 10 gig PON, some homes can have GPON. You don't change the fiber network that you already have in place, what's called the ODN, the outdoor network. And interestingly, I think hats off to the standards folks. When we are introducing HS high-speed PON, which is 50 gig PON in 2023, we'll still use the same outdoor network. It's just that some of us who want it, who can afford it, who need it, can have high-speed PON at 50 gig. Others can continue with GPON, XGS PON, or even GPON. And there's no change in the network. So it's a very nice way to create this multi-PON module, which is backward compatible and can work with everything that is already deployed. One of the things, this slide is too detailed, but you can sort of see that even with HS PON, you will get similar link losses. That's because you use the same outdoor network, 32, 33 dB, but you get 50 gig rates, downlink, 25 gig uplink, or you can get both 50 gig and 50 gig downlink and uplink. So there are a few different varieties. Just like in XG PON, you have a symmetric and an asymmetric version. You can go, about 20 kilometers for most applications. If latency is an issue, you can go about 10 kilometers. But I would say and there's a lot of support for CIPRI, eCIPRI, which is essentially intended to support for mobile backhaul, front haul, mid haul. I'll talk about that on the next slide. There is a redundancy feature to make it more reliable, simply because we're working from home and we need the network to be reliable at home as well. Okay. And the more important thing, I think, is there's a new version of fiber, new type of fiber, which can be bent quite a bit. So those of you who are used to installing fiber optic networks know that fiber can't be bent much. You need a bend radius of several centimeters if you're not to have a lot of loss. But this new fiber 657, you can have a bend radius of just a centimeter with negligible loss. So that's something that will also make it easier to build these networks. PON is designed to do every form of backhaul, front haul, mid haul, or cross haul for 5G. So you can do PON, you can do backhaul between what is called the 5G cloud unit to the core with PON. You can also do the mid haul from the 5G distribution unit, the cloud unit, with PON again, with NG-PON2, because the bandwidth here tends to be a little bit higher. And you can also do front haul between the radio unit and the distribution unit, again with PON. So there are 3 different PON networks, but PON is really being targeted to do all 3 applications for 5G, front haul, mid haul, and a backhaul. Let's look at other access technologies. For wireless, of course, today we have 4G, we have 5G fixed wireless in a few places. These are all in the 2 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz frequency bands, FDD and TDD. Next year, actually some places this year, we have what is called a non-standalone upgrade to 5G, which will work with the existing 4G. It offers higher MIMO, therefore higher capacity, but still focused on broadband, right? Enhanced mobile broadband. Next year, we'll have IoT support in 5G, which will lead to a lot more bigger networks for things, massive machine type communication. There are a few different ways you can use in-band or broadband. So IoT is the next thing to look forward to in 5G. There are also ways to try to make this vendor neutral, have the radio unit and the distribution and the cloud units supplied by different vendors, as well as running on generally available processors, the general processors, as opposed to specialized hardware. So that's the ORAN revolution that we can look forward to. And of course, higher order MIMO in millimeter wave bands, which gives you a lot more capacity, but at the cost of going smaller distances. Then 2-3 years hence, we can look forward to networks that are targeted for public safety. Also some cool things like proximity sensing. We should be able to talk from mobile to another mobile, without actually going through the base station. We can do mission critical push to talk. This is something where you just push a button, like some cab drivers in the US used to do, if you've seen that. And then you can talk to everybody. Group communication services is GCS. So some of these technologies used by firefighters and police and so on are coming into 5G, so that you can have a common network for everyone. So today, the police use old-fashioned walkie-talkies, and we want to integrate that technology. Tejas has a 5G roadmap for its products as well. So today we offer 4G and TDD and FDD bands, but we will have a 5G upgrade on the same product, which will then support radio units and all the new radio bands, starting with N77, N78, which is a 3.5 gigahertz. For enterprise access, which is largely based on carrier Ethernet today. So today, enterprises get E-line services, ELAN services, basically L2 VPN services and carrier Ethernet. We have introduced a product which is a micro OTN, which can provide high capacity, dedicated Ethernet private lines, which is used for high capacity to enterprises as well as mobile backhaul applications. I think enterprises are looking forward to using LTE because that's a better technology than Wi-Fi, even for the communication within the campus. So once the regulations around reusing spectrum from carriers and all that is fixed up, I think we can expect to see private LTE networks within campuses, which will actually make it easier to use our phones, both for office work and accessing the office LAN, as well as the internet. And the same aspect will move to 5G. 2 years from now, we'll have private 5G PON, probably some integrated version of networks for humans and things. And going forward, you will also have public safety LTE networks. So one of the examples could be that LTE networks for firefighters, for police. I think most of us have heard of an LTE network for the railways, which is the private network. So this will be private networks of LTE carved out for public safety applications, such as police and health and railways and so on, firefighters. What's happening in terms of applications in the enterprise access? So I'm taking an example of a big, car factory. So they use a private LTE network. They have trucks carrying cars out, which will all communicate using some form of IoT technology, V2X communications, vehicle to something is X. Right? It could be vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure. The car factory, the assembly of cars could be monitored with a fiber optic network. There's no reason for LTE to be there because it's not really a mobile technology. So I want to tell you that PON also can be used for Internet of Things, not necessarily just 5G. And then if you have a truck which is really moving, then you sort of need 5G on the truck. But if you have a fixed wireless network, for example, a repair station for a car, then you can have Wi-Fi as the last 100 meters of access, then fixed wireless with 5G doing the backhaul. So you will see a mix of all these in many of the campus networks, depending on the applications. So here is how a private LTE network could look like in a big, car factory. These are the three forms of access. Aggregation is not to be left behind. Clearly, bandwidth is growing, but there's also a need for low latency and so on. So today we have, for backhaul, multi-terabit OTN networks. WDM technology takes you today to a few terabits, 8 terabits, 16 terabits, depending on your needs for how long you need to go. It's all fully, the control plane is fully automated with ASON and GMPLS. WDM technology itself is moving to 600 gig per wavelength today, and we'll see 800 gig around the corner. Fiber is scarce in many places. In Africa, for example, many operators have a single strand of fiber. So bidirectional communications with 100 gig is becoming important. And for many reasons, L3 technology is prevalent and useful in the backhaul networks. So L3 VPNs are also being set up in the backhaul. With the advent of 5G next year, we'll have to provide end-to-end slices. So in 5G, there is a notion of an end-to-end slice for each application, for broadband, for a particular, let's say, IoT network, and so on. And that slices will require end-to-end QoS support. So that will start to, that end-to-end QoS will go through the aggregation or backhaul network. So that will start to get supported next year. In the packet technologies, you used to have the biggest advantage was the statistical multiplexing, that you could get any amount of bandwidth flexibly. OTN is not to be left behind. So they're introducing technologies to combine in a flexible way 1 gigabit channels with the Flexi, higher capacity channels with the Flexo technology. Security is a concern, so encryption is being introduced at the L1 level. And again, OTN has a leg up over packet technologies, especially in terms of timing support, independent timing support, low latency support. But no technology is left behind. Packets also evolving. There's a new IEEE standard for time-sensitive networks, especially designed for front haul in 5G, where today OTN has a clear advantage over packet technologies. So that will be coming up probably a couple of years down the line, and that will support eCPRI, which is the technology for 5G front haul. In WDM, we'll start to see 800 gig wavelength. Some vendors have already introduced it, but I think you'll see wider adoption of that. Tejas will have that also in 2023. Moving beyond that, we have segment routing in IP. I think there's a segment routing V6 that comes up. And then I talked about per wavelength capacities going up to 800 gig. Clearly, cross-connect capacities also need to go up, and probably we'll start to see 100 terabit cross connects based on this leaf spine architecture, which got borrowed from the data center technology 2024 or soon thereafter. So this is my last slide. So what can we look forward to at our home in 2030? Okay, so you have fiber everywhere, your fiber coming down to your street. Every lamppost will become a small cell or a hotspot. Um, your fiber will terminate outside your home. So you can expect that just like you have electricity cables and phone cables, you will have fiber everywhere on every road. And probably it would make sense to use the utility infrastructure. So I think some sort of partnership will emerge. The fiber will get terminated at your street pole. You'll probably draw fiber to each room of your house, just like you today draw electrical wiring. You'll draw fiber to each room of your house. You'll have a hotspot in each room. Um, some places where you can't lay fiber, 5G is coming up with integrated access and backhaul. So you can use the same 5G bandwidth, the 5G spectrum, to do backhaul as well, or to go over a few hops that don't have fiber. Today, you may have 1, 2, 3, depending on how big a home you have, Wi-Fi hotspots. But as the frequency range gets larger, like you get terahertz frequency range, you can't get through walls and so on. So every room of your home will have a picocell hotspot. So when you have this picocell, I'll come back to backhaul. So when you don't have fiber, you can do backhaul within 5G. Satellites are widely talked about. Many satellites blanketing the Earth to ensure you have capacity and you have coverage when you're going on your hike or going up the Himalayas or Bhutan or wherever your trekking takes you. And those networks will get tightly integrated with 5G. So it will just be like a handover from a terrestrial network to a satellite network. So those technologies are being brought into 5G. It's a non-terrestrial network. So you can actually move seamlessly without any call drops. And within your home, if you have a hotspot in every room, sometimes for coverage, you need to rely on reflecting the signal. So you need to coat your walls and ceilings, with special coating, which will allow these signals to bounce off. You have to change reflectivity based on the spectrum that you're using. So that's how you can look to build your next home in 2030 as well. To ensure communication, seamless communication everywhere within your home, a combination of fiber to every room, terahertz, optical, it's really light frequency range communication, even within your house. And where you can't get fiber everywhere, but if you can't get fiber, you can use 5G for a quick hop or two. And if there's no infrastructure at all, you use satellites. So this is what lies ahead of us about 10 years from now. Thank you. Thank you. I'll stop here. I missed the Wi-Fi communication, but that's similar to the terahertz.